He was just a 23-year-old art student from New York. But when the army handed him inflatable tanks and a sound effects machine, he created an illusion so perfect that it fooled 40,000 German soldiers and saved thousands of American lives. March 1945, Luxembourg. The US Ninth Army is about to cross the Rhine River into Germany, but there's a problem. German forces outnumber them 3-1 at the crossing point. A frontal assault would be a bloodbath, so the army calls in their secret weapon, a unit of artists, sound engineers, and designers armed with rubber tanks, wooden cannons, and recordings of army noises. Their mission is to convince the Germans that the main attack is coming somewhere else. This is the story of the Ghost Army and the genius deception that won a battle without firing a shot. In early 1944, US Army planners realized they had a problem. When Allied forces invaded Europe, they'd need every advantage they could get: numbers, firepower, air superiority. But there was one resource they couldn't create quickly: troops. Training soldiers takes time, building divisions takes months, and the Germans would be defending their territory with everything they had. But what if you could make the Germans think you had more troops than you actually did? What if you could convince them that divisions were in places they weren't? Make them spread their forces to defend against attacks that would never come, force them to keep reserves positioned against phantom threats. This idea had been used before in warfare: dummy positions, false camps. Deception was as old as war itself, but World War II technology created new possibilities. Aerial reconnaissance meant the enemy could photograph your positions from the air. Radio intercepts meant they could listen to your communications. This made deception harder, but it also meant that if you could fool these technologies, you could fool the entire enemy command structure. The US Army decided to create a unit specifically designed for tactical deception. They needed people who could create convincing illusions, people who understood visual art, sound design, and theater, so they recruited from an unusual pool: art students, stage designers, sound engineers, advertising professionals, people whose peacetime skills involved creating convincing illusions. The unit was officially called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but everyone who knew about them called them the Ghost Army, about 1,100 men total. They were organized into several specialized units. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled visual deceptions. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company, Special, handled radio deceptions. The Signal Company, Special, handled sonic deceptions. And combat engineers provided security and support. One of the soldiers recruited into the Ghost Army was a 23-year-old private named Bill Blass. Yes, that Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers. But in 1944, he was just an art student from Fort Wayne, Indiana, who'd been drafted and assigned to this strange unit that nobody would explain clearly. Blass and his fellow Ghost Army soldiers went through unusual training. They learned camouflage techniques, how to create dummy equipment that would look real from the air, how to mimic radio traffic patterns, how to create sound effects that simulated military operations. They studied German intelligence gathering methods, learned what the enemy would be looking for, learned how to give the enemy exactly what they expected to see while hiding the truth. The equipment they were given was remarkable: inflatable tanks that could be set up in minutes. They looked like Sherman tanks from a distance or from the air, but they were just rubber and air. A few men could carry one rolled up, then inflate it with air compressors. From 200 feet away, they were indistinguishable from real tanks. Up close, they were obviously fake. But the Ghost Army's job was to keep the Germans far enough away that they'd never get a close look. They had inflatable artillery pieces, fake supply dumps made from painted canvas stretched over wooden frames, dummy trucks and jeeps. Everything needed to make it look like a real military unit was positioned somewhere. From the air, German reconnaissance planes would photograph what looked like a fully equipped armored division. On the ground, it was a movie set staffed by artists with paint brushes. The sonic deception equipment was even more creative. The Ghost Army had recordings of various military sounds: tank engines, truck convoys, construction noises, artillery being positioned. These recordings were played through massive speaker systems mounted on trucks. The speakers could project sound for miles. A German listening post would hear what sounded like a large armored unit moving into position. In reality, it was a few trucks with speakers playing recorded sounds. The radio deception was equally sophisticated. The Ghost Army had radio operators who would mimic the communication patterns of real military units. Every division had characteristic radio traffic, certain types of messages at certain times, distinctive call signs and procedures. Ghost Army radio operators would study a real division's communications, then replicate them from a different location. German signals intelligence, listening to these broadcasts, would conclude that the division had moved to a new position. The key to successful deception was coordination. The visual, sonic, and radio elements had to all tell the same story. If you inflated fake tanks in one location, you needed radio traffic consistent with a tank unit and sounds of tank operations. Everything had to reinforce the illusion. Any inconsistency would tip off German intelligence that something was wrong. The Ghost Army first deployed to Europe in summer 1944, shortly after D-Day. Their initial operations were small-scale, learning how to set up deceptions quickly, testing whether their equipment and techniques would fool German intelligence. The results were promising. German forces repositioned based on Ghost Army deceptions. They were taking the bait. By early 1945, the Ghost Army had run over a dozen successful deception operations. They'd helped secure flanks during real offensives by making Germans think attacks were coming from different directions. They'd protected real troop movements by creating fake ones elsewhere. They'd tied down German reserves by threatening attacks that never came. Every successful operation refined their techniques, made their illusions more convincing, taught them new tricks. But their biggest test was coming. Operation Wiesen, the operation that would showcase everything the Ghost Army had learned. The operation where a handful of artists and sound engineers would face off against an entire German army. In March 1945, the Allied advance had reached the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The Rhine was wide, fast-flowing, and heavily defended. Crossing it would be one of the most difficult operations of the entire war. General William Simpson's Ninth Army was tasked with crossing near the town of Wiesen. The problem was that German forces knew the Ninth Army was coming. They'd reinforced the defenses opposite Wiesen with 3 full divisions, about 40,000 troops, artillery, defensive positions. The crossing would be bloody. American casualties would be in the thousands unless something changed the equation. Army planners came up with a deception plan. What if the Germans thought the main crossing was happening somewhere else, specifically 10 miles south at a location where defenses were weaker? If German forces shifted south to meet the fake threat, the real crossing at Wiesen would face lighter opposition, fewer casualties, better chance of success. This deception would require convincing German intelligence that an entire army corps, about 30,000 men, was preparing to cross south of Wiesen. It would need to look real from every angle: ground observation, aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, sonic monitoring, everything. The Germans were smart. They wouldn't be fooled by a half-hearted effort. The illusion had to be perfect. The Ghost Army was given the mission: create the appearance of 2 full divisions, about 30,000 men and their equipment, preparing for a river crossing 10 miles south of where the real crossing would occur. Make it look so convincing that German commanders would commit significant forces to defending against it. Hold the deception for at least 72 hours, long enough for the real crossing to succeed. Bill Blass and about 600 other Ghost Army soldiers moved into position south of Wiesen. They had just days to create an illusion that would fool an enemy with decades of military experience. The pressure was intense. Thousands of lives depended on their ability to sell the lie. The operation began with reconnaissance. Ghost Army officers studied the terrain, identified where real units would position themselves if they were preparing for a river crossing, found locations for assembly areas, supply dumps, artillery positions, and command posts. Everything had to be placed where a real military planner would put it. Any deviation from standard procedure would raise suspicions. Then came the physical setup. Over 2 nights, Ghost Army soldiers inflated hundreds of rubber tanks and artillery pieces. They positioned them in assembly areas with appropriate spacing and camouflage. They created fake supply dumps using canvas and lumber. They parked real trucks and jeeps in patterns that would photograph well from the air, but used far fewer vehicles than would actually be needed, just enough to sell the illusion. The visual component was crucial. German reconnaissance planes flew over regularly. The Ghost Army knew they were being photographed, so they made sure the fake positions would photograph convincingly. They even created vehicle tracks using real vehicles driving in patterns, then parking elsewhere. From the air, it looked like hundreds of vehicles had been moving through the area. In reality, it was a dozen trucks driving back and forth. Blas, working with the camouflage engineers, helped position the dummy equipment. They'd learned that lighting and shadows were critical. A poorly positioned dummy would cast shadows that didn't match a real vehicle. German photo interpreters were trained to spot these inconsistencies, so every dummy had to be positioned to cast realistic shadows at the time of day when German reconnaissance was most active. They also learned that Germans looked for specific indicators of military activity: latrines, communications trenches, command post antennas, anti-aircraft positions. So the Ghost Army created all of these. They dug slit trenches that would be visible from the air. They erected fake radio antennas. They positioned dummy anti-aircraft guns, everything that would normally be present in a real military concentration. The sonic deception began on the second night. Trucks with speaker systems moved into position behind the fake assembly areas. They played recordings of tank engines, truck convoys, and construction activity. The sounds carried for miles. German listening posts across the river heard what sounded like a major military buildup: tank units moving into position, supply convoys arriving, engineers preparing crossing equipment. The Ghost Army had learned that timing was important for sonic deceptions. They played different sounds at different times to simulate a realistic operational schedule: morning sounds of units waking up and conducting maintenance, daytime sounds of construction and positioning, evening sounds of more vehicle movement and equipment positioning, everything following the patterns a real military unit would follow. Radio deception completed the illusion. Ghost Army radio operators began broadcasting, mimicking the communications of two divisions preparing for combat operations. They used proper call signs, proper radio procedures, message traffic that matched what German signals intelligence would expect, orders for reconnaissance, requests for supplies, coordination with higher headquarters, all fake. All designed to convince German intelligence analysts that two American divisions were preparing to cross the Rhine south of Wiesen. The Ghost Army even created fake command posts with appropriate radio traffic. They set up tents with lights visible at night, posted guards, created vehicle traffic, everything that would indicate senior officers were present and planning operations. German observers watching from across the Rhine saw what looked like a major headquarters operation. For 3 days and nights, the Ghost Army maintained their illusion. They worked around the clock, setting up new dummy equipment, moving existing dummies to simulate normal repositioning, playing sonic effects, broadcasting radio traffic, creating a living, breathing fake army that existed only in German intelligence reports. The physical work was exhausting. Inflatable tanks and artillery pieces had to be moved regularly because real units would reposition. They had to be reinflated as they developed leaks. Everything had to look active and real. Any static, unchanging positions would raise suspicions that something was wrong. The stress was incredible. The Ghost Army soldiers knew they were close to German positions. If Germans launched an artillery strike against the assembly area, the Ghost Army would be in the impact zone. If German forces decided to launch a spoiling attack across the river to disrupt the preparations, they'd be attacking the Ghost Army's positions. The artists and sound engineers would be facing combat soldiers with nothing but their wits and a few security guards for protection. And there was always the fear that the deception would fail, that German intelligence would see through the illusion, that all their work would be wasted and the real crossing at Wiesen would face full German defensive strength. Thousands would die because the Ghost Army couldn't sell the lie convincingly enough. On the night of March 23, 1945, the real crossing began at Viersen. The Ninth Army's assault troops hit the east bank of the Rhine in boats and amphibious vehicles. They expected heavy resistance. Instead, they found defenses that were noticeably weaker than intelligence had predicted. German units that should have been at Viersen weren't there. They'd been moved south. The Ghost Army's deception had worked. German commanders, convinced that the main American attack was coming south of Viersen, had shifted forces to defend against it. They'd pulled units from the Viersen sector and repositioned them opposite the Ghost Army's fake assembly areas. When the real attack came at Viersen, those units were 10 miles away, defending against a threat that didn't exist. The Ninth Army crossed the Rhine with casualties far lighter than expected. They established a bridgehead and began pouring forces across. By the time German commanders realized they'd been deceived, it was too late. The Americans were across in strength and couldn't be pushed back. Meanwhile, the Ghost Army maintained their deception for another day. They kept playing their recorded sounds, kept broadcasting radio traffic, kept the dummy equipment in place. German forces opposite their positions stayed put, waiting for an attack that would never come. Every hour those forces stayed in the wrong place was another hour for the real crossing operation to succeed. Finally, on March 25th, the Ghost Army received orders to pack up and move out. The deception had served its purpose. The Rhine crossing was secure. German forces were scrambling to respond, but couldn't reverse the situation. The Ghost Army had won. As they dismantled their fake army, the Ghost Army soldiers felt a mixture of relief and pride. Relief that they'd survived, that German artillery hadn't targeted their positions, that no spoiling attack had hit them, and pride that their work had actually mattered, that their art and engineering and performance had saved lives. Real soldiers had crossed the Rhine and survived because the Ghost Army had convinced the enemy to look the wrong way. After-action intelligence reports showed just how successful the deception had been. German intelligence had filed reports identifying 2 American divisions in the area where the Ghost Army had set up. German commanders had made tactical decisions based on these reports. Units had been moved. Defensive plans had been adjusted, all based on an illusion created by artists with rubber tanks and sound effects. The Ghost Army would go on to run more deception operations before the war ended. In total, they conducted over 20 tactical deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They're credited with saving an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives by drawing German forces away from real attack points. But Operation Viersen was their masterpiece, the perfect execution of everything they'd learned. The operation that proved tactical deception could change the outcome of major battles. The operation where Bill Blass and his fellow artist soldiers outsmarted an entire German army. The story of the Ghost Army was classified for decades after World War II ended. The soldiers who served in it were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't talk about what they'd done, couldn't explain why their service records showed them in combat zones, but never listed any combat actions. For years, their contribution was unknown to the public and largely forgotten even by the military. Bill Blass went back to New York after the war and became one of America's premier fashion designers. He rarely talked about his wartime service. When people asked, he'd say he was in a camouflage unit in Europe, nothing more. The details were classified. It wasn't until the 1990s that the Ghost Army's operations were declassified and their story could be told. What the Ghost Army proved was that warfare isn't just about firepower and numbers. It's about information and perception. The Germans at Viersen had enough troops to stop the American crossing. They had strong defensive positions, good weapons, experienced soldiers, but they lost because they were fed false information and made decisions based on that false information. The Ghost Army didn't fire a single shot, but they won the battle as surely as if they destroyed the German forces with artillery. The Ghost Army also demonstrated the value of unconventional thinking. Most military units are designed to destroy things, to kill enemies, to blow up bridges and buildings. The Ghost Army was designed to deceive, to create illusions, to manipulate enemy perceptions. This required different skills and different approaches. The Army recognized this and recruited people with artistic backgrounds specifically for these skills. This was unusual for the military in the 1940s. Most military leaders didn't value artistic or creative skills. Soldiers were supposed to be tough, not creative. Warriors, not artists. But the Ghost Army proved that creativity could be a weapon, that artistic skills could save lives, that sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy was to fool them rather than fight them. The techniques the Ghost Army developed influenced military deception doctrine for decades. Modern militaries still use similar principles. Create multiple false signatures that reinforce each other. Make the enemy see what they expect to see. Use their intelligence-gathering capabilities against them by feeding them convincing false information. The specifics have changed with technology, but the underlying concepts remain valid. The individual soldiers of the Ghost Army, like Bill Blass, went on to successful peacetime careers. Many became artists, designers, and architects. Their wartime experience gave them unique perspectives. They'd used their creative skills in life-or-death situations. They'd seen their art literally save lives. That's a powerful experience that shaped how they thought about creativity and its purpose. Some Ghost Army veterans said their service taught them that art isn't just decoration. It's communication. It's about creating perceptions and emotions. During the war, they used art to create false perceptions that fooled enemies. After the war, they used similar skills to create advertising, fashion, and design that communicated messages and created emotional responses. The underlying skill was the same. The Ghost Army also demonstrated the importance of attention to detail. The difference between a successful deception and a failed one was often tiny details. A shadow cast at the wrong angle. A piece of equipment positioned where it wouldn't normally be. Radio traffic that followed the wrong pattern. German intelligence analysts were trained to spot these inconsistencies. The Ghost Army had to get every detail right, or the entire deception would collapse. This obsessive attention to detail under pressure is what made them effective. They couldn't just create something that looked approximately right. It had to be exactly right. The positions had to match where real units would be. The sounds had to match what real operations sounded like. The radio traffic had to match real communications patterns. Any deviation would trigger suspicion. The stress of maintaining these deceptions for days at a time was enormous. The Ghost Army soldiers knew they were creating illusions that would draw enemy attention and possibly enemy fire. They were deliberately making themselves targets to protect real units elsewhere. That takes a special kind of courage. Not the courage to charge into battle, but the courage to stand in a fake tank knowing that if the enemy believes it's real, they'll shoot at you. The Ghost Army's work also raises interesting ethical questions about the nature of warfare. Is deception more or less ethical than direct combat? They saved lives by tricking enemies into making bad decisions. Those enemies suffered and died because of decisions based on false information. Is that better or worse than killing them directly in combat? There's no simple answer, but it's worth thinking about. What's clear is that the Ghost Army's deceptions were tactically and strategically sound. They achieved military objectives with minimal casualties on both sides. The German forces defending against phantom attacks at Viersen weren't killed. They were just in the wrong place. When they moved to counter the real American advance, they fought and some died, but probably fewer than would have died if they'd successfully defended the initial crossing. The legacy of the Ghost Army extends beyond military tactics. Their story is a reminder that problems can be solved in unexpected ways, that conventional approaches aren't always the best approaches, that creativity and innovation can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. A few hundred artists with inflatable tanks defeated forces that numbered in the tens of thousands because they thought differently about the problem. The Ghost Army also shows the value of diverse skills in any organization. The U.S. Army in World War II needed infantry soldiers who could assault positions. It needed tank crews who could operate armored vehicles. It needed pilots who could fly missions. But it also needed artists who could create convincing illusions. Each skill set was valuable in its own way. Each contributed to victory in different ways. Bill Blass, reflecting on his Ghost Army service decades later, said that those years taught him lessons he used throughout his design career. How to work under pressure, how to pay attention to details, how to create illusions that convinced people, how to collaborate with others toward a common goal. Skills learned creating fake armies translated directly to creating fashion that convinced people they looked good. The Ghost Army was disbanded shortly after the war ended. The equipment was destroyed or mothballed. The soldiers went home. For decades, they couldn't talk about what they'd done, but they'd accomplished something remarkable. They'd proven that you don't always need more guns to win battles. Sometimes you just need better illusions. That one person with the right skills and the right idea can change the outcome of a conflict involving thousands. The 23-year-old art student from Fort Wayne who helped create fake armies ended up designing clothes for presidents and celebrities. But his most important work, the work that actually saved lives, was done with rubber and canvas and imagination. That's the real story of Bill Blass and the Ghost Army, not just that they fooled the Germans, but that they proved creativity is a weapon, that art can save lives. That sometimes the best way to win a war is to make the enemy fight phantoms while you strike where they're not looking.